Beneath London, the Northern Line passes through places that most passengers never notice, including a station that was built but never opened, an empty turning loop where staff have reported movement inside cleared carriages, and abandoned platforms where the sound of trains is still said to be heard long after the tracks were removed. These accounts come from different parts of the line, but many are linked by the same unsettling idea: journeys that were interrupted, abandoned, or never properly begun. In this video, we follow the Northern Line through its hidden stations, reported hauntings, and the documented events that helped those stories take hold. The Northern Line is London's busiest tube line, first opened on the 18th of December 1890. Today it runs for 58 kilometres, across 52 stations from Edgware and High Barnet in the north to Morden and Battersea Power Station in the south. It features two central branches, Bank and Charing Cross, and multiple northern and southern termini, making it the most complex route on the network. It runs through some of the oldest and most heavily altered parts of London. Along its route are stations abandoned before they ever opened, wartime shelters struck by bombs, platforms connected with fatal accidents, and forgotten railway spaces that most passengers will never see. These places are now associated with figures waiting on disused platforms, footsteps in sealed passages, phantom passengers, and staff members sensing they are no longer alone. Some of these accounts are tied to documented events. Others belong to underground folklore, repeated by workers and commuters until the original source has become difficult to trace. In several cases, the history is clear, but the connection between that history and the reported haunting is far less certain. Not every story has an answer, and not every ghost has a name. But beneath London, where trains pass through spaces built over earlier versions of the city, some journeys appear to have left something behind. Between Hampstead and Golders Green, Northern Line trains pass through a stretch of tunnel that looks ordinary unless someone knows exactly where to look. Hidden in the darkness are the unfinished remains of North End Station, better known by its informal name, Bull and Bush. Unlike most abandoned underground stations, North End did not close because passenger numbers declined. It never opened at all. Work began in the early years of the 20th century when plans were being made for a new residential development around Hampstead Heath. The station was intended to serve the people expected to move into the area, but the development never happened on the scale its backers had imagined. With too few future passengers to justify the cost, construction was stopped before the station could be completed. What remained beneath the ground was an unfinished network of platforms, passageways, and shafts, later made more mysterious by Cold War rumours and its separation from the public underground. Passengers travelling through the area today may notice a wider gap in the tunnel wall where the platforms were meant to be. The train does not slow down, and there is no station name displayed in the darkness. For most people, it passes too quickly to register. For maintenance staff who enter the site, however, North End is not merely a shape glimpsed from a moving carriage, it is an area left behind from another era. Stories attached to the station often describe an oppressive atmosphere, unexplained footsteps, and the uneasy sense that someone is watching from beyond the reach of the work lights. These reports are difficult to trace to named witnesses, but they have become part of the folklore surrounding the abandoned space. The station's unofficial name comes from the nearby Old Bull and Bush pub, a building with ghost stories of its own. One legend concerns a soldier named Cedric, said to have been beaten to death in 1818, while another tells of a figure in Victorian clothing seen around the grounds. During the 1980s, the discovery of a skeleton alongside what was described as surgical equipment behind a cellar wall led to speculation that something darker had once taken place there. Some later retellings even drew a connection with Jack the Ripper. The stories attached to the pub and the station gradually became difficult to separate. A haunting reported above ground was linked to the tunnels below, while the abandoned railway gave a hidden setting to legends that may have begun elsewhere. This movement between neighbouring locations is common in underground folklore. Once an area gains a reputation, the boundaries between one building, one tunnel, and one story can become blurred. North End's later history added another layer. Rumours circulated that the station had been adapted as an emergency headquarters for London transport in the event of a nuclear attack. Some versions went further, claiming it might have been intended as a secondary refuge for Winston Churchill. Churchill's better-known paddock bunker was at Dollis Hill, making the North End connection uncertain. Even so, the Cold War use of hidden underground spaces was real enough to make such stories believable. A station that had never opened, sealed away from ordinary passengers and associated with emergency planning, already had everything required for rumours to grow. That may be the real reason North End remains so unsettling. It is not a ruined station remembered by former passengers, nor a closed platform still carrying traces of its public life. It is a place built for people who never arrived. Every train that passes through the darkness completes the journey North End was meant to join. The station remains beside the track, unfinished and silent, while the Northern Line continues without it. King's Cross St Pancras is one of the busiest stations in London, used by several underground lines, as well as the main railway terminals above. On the evening of the 18th of November 1987, that ordinary flow of passengers was broken by one of the worst disasters in the history of the Underground. The fire began beneath a wooden escalator serving the Piccadilly line. At first, it appeared to be relatively small, but heat and flames travelled rapidly through the escalator shaft. Investigators later identified what became known as the trench effect, in which the shape and angle of the escalator helped the fire accelerate upwards with devastating force. 31 people lost their lives. Although the fire did not begin on the Northern Line platforms, it affected the wider station complex and became part of the shared memory of those who worked there. King's Cross is an interchange, and staff moving through its passages do not experience each line as a completely separate place. The disaster belonged to the station as a whole. When the station reopened, the trains returned, and daily routines gradually resumed. For staff members, however, the events of 1987 were not simply an entry in a history book. Some had been working at King's Cross that night, while others knew colleagues who had witnessed the fire or its aftermath. Reports of unusual experiences began to circulate among those working late shifts. One member of the night staff, said to have been working near the lower concourse during the early 1990s, noticed the smell of smoke while cleaning after hours. The odour was faint, and no alarm sounded. He searched for a source but found nothing, and the smell faded within a few minutes. Similar accounts have described a brief smell of burning, unexpected warmth near the escalator area, and the impression that the station was crowded when no passengers were present. These are quieter reports than the dramatic apparitions often associated with the Underground. There is no clearly visible ghost, and no figure stepping from the darkness. What witnesses describe instead are physical sensations that recall the disaster itself. An engineer working late during the early 2000s reportedly experienced a sudden wave of heat while passing the escalator. It lasted only a few seconds. When he returned to the same position, the temperature felt normal. What unsettled him was not simply the warmth, but the way it immediately reminded him of the fire, even though he had not been employed at the station in 1987. He knew the history through training and through stories shared by other staff. That detail matters because King's Cross presents a difficult question. Can a place retain something from a traumatic event, or does knowledge of that event shape the way later experiences are understood? A sudden change in temperature inside a large station may have an ordinary cause. Ventilation, electrical equipment, and moving trains all affect the air. The smell of smoke may come from machinery, dust, or material heated elsewhere in the system. Yet at King's Cross, such sensations carry a meaning they would not have at another station. A faint burning smell is never merely a smell once the history of the place is known. There is also the effect of working alone after the station has quietened. During the day, King's Cross is filled with announcements, footsteps, luggage, and constant movement. Late at night, those familiar surroundings change character. Empty passageways make small sounds easier to notice, while memory supplies a possible explanation before the source has been found. None of this proves that the reports are supernatural, but it helps explain why they have remained part of the station's folklore. The witnesses are not usually describing elaborate visions. They speak of smoke where nothing is burning, heat that vanishes almost immediately, and the sense of a crowd that is no longer there. The reports at King's Cross centre on the memory of a real event, preserved through training, conversation, and the experiences of those who continued working at the station afterward. On the night of the 14th of October 1940, air raid sirens sounded across London as another bombing attack began. Balham Underground Station became a shelter, with hundreds of people crowded below street level in the hope that the tunnels would offer protection. A bomb struck the road above the station a few hours later. The blast brought part of the street down onto the station entrance and ruptured a water main. Debris, mud and water poured into the lower levels, trapping people beneath the ground. More than 60 people were killed in the station and on the streets above. Photographs taken afterward showed the scale of the destruction. A bus had fallen into the crater left in the road, while the collapse exposed the station beneath. Balham became one of the most shocking underground disasters of the Blitz, not because the station failed as a shelter, but because the violence above forced its way directly into the place where people had gathered for safety. Repairs followed, and the station eventually returned to normal service. Trains began running again, commuters resumed their journeys, and Balham became part of the everyday routine of South London. For many years, the station was not widely associated with ghost stories. The tragedy remained part of its wartime history, but reports of paranormal activity were far less prominent than at some other underground locations. That changed as accounts from staff began to circulate, particularly from those working after the last trains had gone. Staff working around the lower levels and main stairwell have described an unusual stillness after the station has emptied. Some have spoken of a heavy atmosphere, a sense of sadness, and the uncomfortable feeling that they were not entirely alone. The history of the disaster inevitably shapes how such experiences are understood. Anyone employed at Balham is likely to know what happened there in 1940. The memorials, the surviving photographs, and local accounts ensure that the event has not been forgotten. A quiet stairwell or sudden unease may feel very different when a person knows that the same area once filled with water, rubble, and frightened civilians. There is another reason the folklore remains restrained. Unlike many underground legends, Balham is not associated with a named ghost or a dramatic apparition. There is no single figure repeatedly seen on the platform, and no agreed identity for whatever may still be present. The accounts are quieter, a sense of sadness, an unnatural stillness, and the feeling that the lower levels are not entirely empty. That restraint makes the station's reputation more unsettling rather than less. The stories do not attempt to turn the victims into characters or claim that one particular person continues to haunt the station. They suggest only that the disaster changed the atmosphere of the place, and that some of those who work there believe a trace of that night still remains. Beyond Kennington Station, trains terminating on the Charing Cross branch continue into a curved section of track that most passengers never see. After everyone has left the carriages, the train moves beyond the platform, follows the loop beneath the surrounding streets, and returns to Kennington facing north, ready to begin another service. The loop exists for a practical reason. It allows the train to turn around without the driver having to change ends and reverse through the station. Although this is part of the normal operation of the Northern Line, the section beyond the platform feels very different from an ordinary journey. There are no passengers waiting ahead, no open station entrances, and no signs fixed to the tunnel walls. The brightly lit train moves through a hidden part of the railway, surrounded by darkness and the close curve of the tunnel. The account heard at the beginning of this video is the best-known story connected with the Kennington Loop. Drivers and guards have spoken of interconnecting doors moving through a train that had already been cleared, with the sound appearing to travel from one carriage to the next. Other reports describe footsteps, sudden coldness, and the unmistakable impression that someone is moving farther back inside the train. For underground staff familiar with the normal sounds of the carriages, such experiences are difficult to dismiss immediately. The doors between older carriages were heavy and produced a recognizable sound when opened or closed. Inside the enclosed curve of the loop, that noise could carry through the train in a way that made it seem as though someone was steadily approaching the cab. The identity later attached to the haunting is uncertain because more than one death has become associated with the story. One version concerns a passenger who supposedly tried to board a departing train during the 1950s by climbing into the gap between two carriages. According to the account, he was dragged into the loop and killed. Some retellings also claim that the accident led to the introduction of barriers between carriages, although railway historians have linked those safety measures more closely to a separate fatal accident at Liverpool Street. Another possible connection is Frederick Norman, a 21-year-old railway worker who was electrocuted at Kennington in 1926. His death is documented, and his name has since appeared in versions of the haunting, although it is not clear whether the earliest staff reports identified him as the presence inside the loop. It is possible that the legend developed from several separate elements: a genuine death at Kennington, a later story involving someone trapped between carriages, and the experiences of drivers travelling through the loop after the train had been emptied. As those accounts were repeated among staff, they may have gradually formed the story of a passenger whose journey continued beyond the point where it should have ended. Elephant and Castle is one of South London's busiest interchanges, serving both the Northern and Bakerloo lines. During the day, its platforms and connecting passages are rarely still, but after the crowds thin and the final services begin, the station has a very different atmosphere. Its best-known story concerns a young woman who is said to board a northbound Northern Line train late at night. Witnesses describe her as looking entirely ordinary. She is not dressed in historic clothing, nor does she appear pale or transparent. She enters the carriage like any other passenger and may sit quietly among the few people still travelling. Nothing seems unusual until someone notices that she has disappeared. Passengers who remember seeing her board have reported that she does not appear to leave at any of the following stations. There is no moment when she rises from her seat, walks towards the doors, or joins the people stepping onto the platform. Somewhere during the journey, she is simply no longer there. In some versions of the account, the woman is first noticed in the carriage window. A passenger sees her reflection sitting nearby, but when they turn towards the seat, no one is there. Looking back at the glass, they may catch another glimpse of her before the train enters a brightly lit station and the reflection vanishes. She has become known as the phantom passenger of Elephant and Castle, although no single identity has been firmly attached to her. Descriptions of her age and clothing vary, but most versions agree that she appears to be a modern traveller. That ordinary appearance is what makes the encounter so unsettling, because nothing distinguishes her from anyone else until she is gone. The station also has a long tradition of unexplained sounds after closing time. Staff working late shifts have reported hearing footsteps crossing tiled passages after passengers should have left. Some accounts describe the sharp tapping of high-heeled shoes moving through the station just beyond sight. Workers have followed the sound into another corridor, expecting to find a colleague or someone who missed the final train, only for the passage ahead to be empty. The footsteps may seem to approach, stop abruptly, or change direction before anyone comes into view. Another story told among station staff concerns what has become known as the runner. This account involves the sound of someone sprinting through the closed station. Employees have heard hurried footsteps echoing along the corridors, sometimes moving rapidly towards them before turning away or disappearing. The runner is rarely described as a visible figure. Its presence is known only through the speed and direction of the footsteps, creating the impression that someone is racing through the station after everyone else has gone. Elephant and Castle's tiled walls, stairways, and connecting passages can carry sounds from one part of the station into another. A noise that appears close may have begun on a different platform, while the movement of trains elsewhere in the interchange can produce echoes that are difficult to place. For passengers, Elephant and Castle remains an ordinary interchange where people hurry between platforms and pay little attention to those sitting around them. Yet, on the final northbound services, one question remains. If a young woman boards the train and her reflection is still visible in the window, at which station did she leave? Bank Station lies beneath one of the oldest and most heavily developed parts of the City of London, where modern offices, medieval churches, burial grounds and railway tunnels occupy the same small area. The Northern Line platforms form only one part of a large interchange, but the station's best-known ghost story began above ground, long before the Underground arrived. The figure is usually called the Black Nun, although she was neither a nun nor connected with a religious order. Her name was Sarah Whitehead, and the dark clothing that gave rise to the nickname was worn in mourning for her brother. Sarah's brother, identified in different versions as Philip or Paul Whitehead, worked as a clerk at the Bank of England. In 1811, he was arrested for forgery after becoming involved in the falsification of a financial document. He was convicted and executed on the 29th of January, 1812. According to the story, Sarah was not immediately told what had happened. When she eventually discovered the truth, she went to the Bank of England looking for him and demanded to know where he was. The loss appears to have affected the rest of her life. For approximately 25 years, Sarah returned to the bank, dressed in black mourning clothes and a heavy veil. She repeatedly asked staff whether they had seen her brother, as though she still expected him to return to the building where he had once worked. Her regular appearances became so familiar that employees began referring to her as the Black Nun. Sarah died during the 1830s and was buried in the churchyard of St. Christopher le Stocks, which stood beside the Bank of England. The church had already been demolished as the bank expanded, and its burial ground was later absorbed into the surrounding development. Reports of Sarah's ghost were first associated with the Bank of England rather than the Underground station. A woman in black was said to appear near the building, still searching for her brother, and occasionally asking those who encountered her whether they had seen him. As Bank Station expanded beneath the same area, the story travelled underground and became attached to its corridors and platforms. That movement from the street into the station is understandable. The Bank of England, the former churchyard, and the Underground are all close together, while the station's maze of passages stretches beneath buildings that have occupied the site for centuries. For someone familiar with Sarah's story, a dark figure glimpsed at the far end of a passage could easily seem connected with the woman who spent so many years returning to the same part of London. Staff and passengers have also reported other unexplained disturbances at Bank. Accounts include groans or cries heard through the tunnels, a foul smell compared with an open grave, and knocking from behind lift doors after passenger service had ended. Some of these experiences may have ordinary causes. Bank is a deep and complicated station where sounds travel between platforms, lift shafts, and connecting passages. Air moving through tunnels can carry unpleasant smells from drains, machinery, or construction areas, while a knock heard behind a closed door may have begun somewhere much farther away. Sarah Whitehead's story has survived for a different reason. Unlike many underground ghosts, she was a real woman whose grief was witnessed repeatedly during her lifetime. Her visits to the Bank of England, her black mourning clothes, and her questions about her brother created the image long before later generations began reporting her ghost. The supernatural part of the story may have grown in the retelling, but its emotional center remained unchanged. Sarah continued returning to the place where she believed answers might be found, even when everyone around her knew that her brother would never come back. Highgate is one of the more unusual locations on the Northern Line because the station exists on 2 levels, but only the lower platforms remain in regular underground use. Above them are the abandoned remains of an earlier railway, once intended to become part of a much larger expansion known as the Northern Heights project. The high-level station originally served a steam railway running through North London. Plans were later made to incorporate the route into the underground, electrify the line, and extend services farther into the suburbs. Work began, but the scheme was interrupted by the Second World War and was never completed as first intended. The upper platforms were eventually closed, the tracks were removed, and the site was left behind while Northern Line trains continued to run below. Nature gradually reclaimed the railway cutting, and the former route became part of the Parkland Walk. The abandoned platforms still survive, partly hidden by trees and undergrowth, giving the station a very different character from the busy interchange passengers use today. People walking along the old railway route have reported hearing what sounds like a train approaching at speed, even though no rails remain. The sound is said to rise suddenly, pass through the cutting, and then fade without any engine appearing. Some accounts also describe a man in Victorian clothing waiting near the disused platforms, as though he is expecting a service that ceased running decades ago. The setting makes those stories easy to imagine. The route still resembles a railway in places, with old bridges, retaining walls, and the remains of platforms visible beneath the vegetation. A person walking there at dusk may hear traffic, wind, or trains on the active lines below, but the shape of the cutting can make those sounds appear to come from the abandoned track itself. Highgate's reputation is also influenced by the nearby cemetery, one of the best-known burial grounds in London. During the 1970s, the cemetery became the centre of stories about a tall, dark figure, strange lights, and an alleged vampire. Newspaper coverage, rival ghost hunters, and public fascination turned the reports into what later became known as the Highgate vampire affair. The original cemetery stories did not begin inside the underground station, but the closeness of the two locations encouraged the legends to overlap. Figures reported among the graves were later said to wander towards the railway, while the abandoned platforms provided another hidden setting for stories already attached to the area. One recurring account concerns a tall man wearing a top hat. Another describes a shrouded figure moving through the cemetery. Another legend concerns a distressed woman said to run among the graves while searching for her children, with later versions placing her inside the station tunnels. The abandoned high-level station remains the strongest part of that setting because it is real and still visible. It was built for a railway future that never arrived, then left above an active underground line where thousands of passengers continue travelling each day. Below ground, Highgate functions as an ordinary Northern Line station. Above it, the remains of another railway wait among the trees, while walkers occasionally report hearing a train returning to tracks that disappeared long ago. South Kentish Town opened in 1907 and served passengers for less than 20 years before closing in 1924. It was never one of the busiest stations on the Northern Line, and when a strike affected its lifts, the closure that followed became permanent. The platforms remained in place beneath Kentish Town Road, hidden behind the tunnel walls, while trains continued to pass through without stopping. Like many abandoned underground stations, South Kentish Town soon became more interesting in memory than it had ever been during its working life. Its best-known story began with a passenger who stepped off a train at the wrong station. According to an account published in a railway staff magazine in 1933, a man named Mr. Brackett was travelling late at night and became distracted while reading his newspaper. When the train stopped near the disused platform, he assumed he had reached an open station and stepped out before realising that the platform was dark and abandoned. The basic incident appears to have been genuine, but the version later repeated across London became far more dramatic. In the embellished story, the unfortunate passenger was trapped underground for an entire week and survived by scraping paste from old advertising posters. That detail gave the tale its lasting appeal. A simple mistake became a nightmare about isolation, darkness, and survival in a station that no longer officially existed. The story was retold again in 1951 by John Betjeman, who renamed the passenger Basil Green. His version helped carry the incident beyond railway circles and into wider London folklore. The reality was less alarming. The passenger who stepped onto the abandoned platform was reportedly discovered and rescued within a much shorter period. He was not forced to live on wallpaper paste, nor did he spend a week wandering through forgotten tunnels. South Kentish Town has since been used for tours and immersive events, including an escape room experience that draws directly on the legend of the trapped traveller. What began as an accidental exit from a train became part of the station's identity nearly a century later. The site remains closed to regular passengers, but trains still pass through the old platforms. Most people travelling between Camden Town and Kentish Town see only darkness beyond the windows and never realise that a station is there. Which of these Northern Line stories would make you most uneasy? Hearing movement inside an empty train, passing a station that never opened, or waiting beside platforms where trains are still said to return after the tracks have gone? Share your thoughts in the comments, along with any unusual experience you have had on the London Underground. Good night.